As technology allowed for it, journalists quickly learned to take advantage of the power of images. As early as the 1840s, newspapers began including illustrations, charts, and maps with their articles. At this time, drawing was the primary method of conveying imagery, in the same way that painting was the mode de jour of conveying a likeness, of capturing the truth of a person. For example, this portrait of Philip IV by Velázquez in 1644. And it's for good reason that painting was the primary method of capturing a likeness, because even at the beginning of photography, as photography started to come out and make a name for itself, it was fairly unrefined. And so you could actually get a much truer likeness through painting than you could through photography. Not to mention the fact that you had to sit for a photograph almost as long as you would have to sit for a painting anyway. The earliest exposures could take 8 hours or longer. However, as time goes on and technologies advance, photography begins to get a little more refined and a little quicker. And just 30 years later, we see this photograph of Abraham Lincoln. And there's a striking amount of detail being able to be captured here. And you can tell it must have taken a fraction of the time as the first photograph, because he's actually able to maintain a smile for the duration of the exposure. And so painting actually has a crisis of identity here, where it has to realize it is no longer cornering the market on truth in representation. And it has to figure out for itself what is its role in the imagery industry again. Now that photography can come in and do a better and quicker job of capturing the exact likeness of something, painting is freed up to take on more of an appetite for abstraction. And so you see abstract painting getting a much greater presence, because it no longer has to be the record keeper that photography can now become. And so you start to see photography being used more and more to document events in journalism. In 1855, Roger Fenton takes this photograph of the Crimean War called The Valley of the Shadow of Death. And this is generally considered the beginning of war photography. And by the late 1870s, John Thompson uses photos like this to enhance text, to give a face to a personal interest story, human interest story. Now, something very strange happens in the late 1990s when Susan Sontag, an art historian, discovers that this image looks very much like the image that Roger Fenton had taken. And it turns out that these are two images, both taken by Roger Fenton, both of the Crimean War. However, one of them, you'll notice, is lacking a significant number of cannonballs. And Susan Sontag wonders if perhaps one of these photos could have been manipulated. And this is a shocking thing to consider, that a photo in the mid-1800s could have been a photo manipulation, could have undermined the truth of the image, the veracity of the image. And so American film director Errol Morris, who sort of made a name for himself with investigative documentaries, decided to take on this challenge. He wanted to figure out which came first, this first photograph or the second photograph. Were the cannonballs removed? Were they added? Were they faked? What actually happened between these two images? So first he does some chemical analysis on these photographs and finds out that they were both taken within a few hours of each other, but it's hard to tell which one is taken first. So he decides to go all the way to Crimea to study everything down to the shadows of these balls. He actually goes to a museum and borrows the exact cannonballs that would have been taking part in this war, and he recreates the scene cannonball for cannonball to try and figure out what could have happened. Is it possible that this was a natural progression? Could the cannonballs have rolled? What could have been going on here? And he still can't tell. So he talks to a friend of his by the name of Dennis Purcell, who's an image editor and optical engineer. And he goes into his lab and he's trying to figure out what is going on in these images and burning the midnight oil and can come to no conclusions. And finally, at a loss, you might notice it too if you look carefully enough. But if you look on the left bank, a rock moves. Now, being the deft image editor that he is, he knows that gravity only works one way, which means if a rock is falling downhill, the image in which it is lower must have come second, and the image in which it is higher must have come first. What he discovers is that the image with the cannonballs was actually taken after the image without the cannonballs. This means that Roger Fenton arrived on the scene and saw something like this. He decided that this did not quite adequately convey what he considered to be the danger and plight of the Crimean War situation. And so he decided, within a few hours, to take all of those cannonballs that are there in the ravine and spread them all over the path, all over the road. Now, this is not entirely implausible. Probably these cannonballs did end up here because they were being shot at this road. However, the fact of the matter is they did not land as you see them here. Did this undermine the truth of this image? Well, it turns out that the same way that photography disrupted painting and forced painting to reevaluate what it was good at, photo manipulations like this, and especially photo manipulations like Photoshop, really caused photography to have a crisis of identity as well. It used to be that photographs were about veracity, about truth, and trying to convey the accurate image of what it is showing. This went out the window with Photoshop. And so we start to see that what photography is really good at is not necessarily showing the truth of the image, but about emotional connection. Photos can be manipulated, but they still convey empathy. And so Fenton's photos were technically a visual lie, but they were an emotional truth. And so we as a culture start to realize that photography is more of a medium of empathy than it is of veracity. As journalists and media practitioners, we have an opportunity to realize the power of images to create an empathic connection with our audience. And so next we're going to take a look at just how some journalists have done this in the more concrete terms.